The sermon today will be given by Reverend Tina Simpson, entitled Democracy Did Not Die. It's time to get dressed and walk out the front door. In the decades to come, what story will generations tell about this challenging time, and what part will we play? Unitarian Universalism has a strong history steeped in unfolding democracy. What can each of us do to assure our communities and our country promote moral values to support the well-being of all? Let's put our heads together and write the story together. Reverend Tina Simpson is Minister Emeritus from the First Unitarian Church in Rochester, where she faithfully served for 9 years as Minister of Spiritual Development and Pastoral Care. At present, she mentors and facilitates for UU Wellspring, has an active spiritual counseling practice, and this year will once again assist the UUEA with our Souls Matter small group program. Tina is an interfaith minister, educated and ordained through One Spirit Interfaith Seminary in New York City, and holds a certification in spiritual counseling. She's an associate member of the UU Ministers Association. And most of us know all that stuff, but it's so impressive, it's worth reading again. So, Tina?
All right, I'm going to start with a reading from the author Stephanie Dowrick, Thoughts on New Year's Day 2025. We know what's wrong with our immense, wondrous world. We know what's needed: putting the children first, protecting the planet, curbing greed, refusing injustice, accelerating loving kindness and care. We have a revolution right here. 2025 is our glorious opportunity to turn around the good ship, Mother Earth. There are far more people in the world who want to live in peace than those who benefit from violence. Far more. Let our voices be heard. Together we can achieve change. Individual efforts count. Every individual effort counts. On the first days of each year, it is worth asking, why am I here? What can my existence contribute to the greater good? Don't rush at the answer. It may be subtle or unexpected. When it comes, breathe out with relief. You are a part, an essential part of a magnificent whole. Loving kindness is a privilege, not a burden. It radiates and illuminates. It takes you forward every day to a new beginning. Peace in your heart, peace in our world, joy and vitality everywhere. Happy New Year. On November 7th, 2024, after I got up off the floor, I called my state representative, Jen Lunsford. You see, I worked on her campaigns since 2020 when we wrestled the 135th District, New York Assembly District, and Senate seat from the entrenched Republicans. I wanted to congratulate her on the 2024 win. I left a message, but I must have sounded a bit distraught because within an hour she called me back. What do we do now? I asked her, referring to what I saw as a tragic outcome of the presidential election. I also hadn't gotten dressed in 2 days. Here's what she said to me. I know it's hard. Take some time, mourn, but at some point we all must get dressed and walk out the front door. There is so much to do. Tina, governing happens every day, not just election day. Actually, it's the real work that begins after the election. Honestly, she said, that's the most important work. I've told this story often since November because it highlighted just how hard our representatives work on our behalf. We have an obligation to be an active part of this most important work. Now, Unitarian Universalism is steeped in a long history of promoting democracy through some of our most challenging times in the history of this country and in the history of the modern world. From saving refugees during Nazi Germany, to fighting for civil rights in the 1960s, to assuring women's productive freedom, to supporting marriage equality, to working for Black Lives Matter, and more, we have sided with love and done the hard work. This is our story. And yet, our work is not done. It's not even close. At times like this, I look to leaders in our faith tradition for insight and some reminders and hopefully some solace. I found these words written by Reverend Susan Frederick Gray. She's a recent past president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Here's what she writes. We recognize it is no small endeavor to create a true democratic society. Unitarian Universalists' commitment to justice, equity, and democracy is not just political or moral even. It is fundamentally theological. It grows from our affirmation at the inherent worth and dignity of every person and the knowledge that we are interconnected. Human dignity and interdependence are the foundation of our commitment to a multiracial, pluralistic democracy. Living the values of the Unitarian Universalism call is not easy. They call us to audaciously imagine a world where no one is disposable, where everyone can thrive. They also call us to the struggle that brings these ideals to fruition. They call us to the struggle. I was hoping the struggle was going to be over on November 7th, but hey, here we are. This is the prelude to our story of 2025. UU calls us to the struggle. As we approached the 2024 election, it seemed as if our Democratic leaders, our liberal news outlets, and social media claimed that this was a do or die election. If we didn't vote and elect Vice President Harris, democracy would die. It was up to us, and the voters had to make sure that it happened. And the energy to get the vote out was powerful. This congregation wrote thousands of letters encouraging people to vote. It was a commendable effort. And in the back of my mind, I thought to myself, okay, what if she loses? Now, this was a question that lived in my heart. From the moment her candidacy was announced, it was a question that I was even frightened to voice out loud. What if she lost? What happens then? Will this be the end of America? When I preached here in November, right before the election, I spoke of hope. I had hope. And yet I have struggled to keep that hope alive since then. To soothe my weary heart, I began reading the inevitable post-election analyses. Maybe you did too. I slowly realized that all is not doom and gloom. Now, perhaps I chose to read those pieces exclusively, you know how that happens on social media and news outlets, but they made sense to me. As I looked back in the history of our country, times have been worse. Times have been worse. And yet justice did prevail. Democracy did not die. Here's a quote from an article in The Atlantic by McKay Coppins titled, "This is not the end of America. Democracy lives in the people." He points to the swell of progressive activity in 2016 as a sign of hope for 2025. Here's what he says. In 2016, Trump's surprise victory was met with a groundswell of small d Democratic energy. There were marches in the street and record-breaking donations to the ACLU and waves of grassroots organizing. Subscriptions surged at newspapers committed to holding the new administration to account. Books about combating tyranny became bestsellers. The energy wasn't contained to the liberal resistance movement, he says. Conservative expats launched their own political groups and publications. These warnings of impending autocracy in America at that time helped propel a spirit of loud, uncompromising opposition. Friends, perhaps this kind of groundswell will happen again in 2025. But I'm afraid that, frankly, we're exhausted by this fight and stressed by a movement that seems impossible to shift. But my hope is growing, and here's where it finds grounding. At the end of this article by Coppin, he tells this story. I met a young woman, a 19-year-old Harvard student. As a poet, she spends a lot of time thinking about language that shapes our politics, and she told me she resents what she considers hyperbolic rhetoric in the media about the end of democracy. A professor had recently taught her that the root of the Greek word for democracy, demos, means people, and krasia means rule. The power of the people doesn't disappear overnight just because the White House is occupied by a non-progressive leader. He goes on to say, she says, I don't think democracy lives in an institution. Democracy lives in the people. As long as the people hold on to that spirit, it will be impossible to kill. 19-year-old Harvard student. We are the people. Democracy lives in each of us. Don't get me wrong, there are serious threats to our freedom. People who are dear to us will be hurt. Efforts will be made by the rich and powerful to disenfranchise us. It's happening every day. And yet, there are ways to fight back. Here are some things to remember. Trump did not win a majority of votes. He has a plurality of 49%. This does not make a mandate. Harris won 48.4% of the popular vote, and her proposed policies were more attractive to all voters, even Trump voters, than his. Had just 750,000 voters in the swing states voted for Kamala Harris, we would be living in a different reality right now. There is a very slim majority in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. Within 2 years, shifts again are possible. It happened in 2018, and it can happen again. It depends on us. So how do we do this? What's the story we want to tell about our hard work for democracy during this challenging time? Here's some tips from she is a reverend, I think, Representative Jen Lunsford from the 135th District in New York. She reminds us that voting is only a small part of the work of governing. Voters need to talk to their representatives, and honestly, most of us don't. We need to know what's happening in committees, what's on the floor. The work of the representatives is the work of the people, not their work. It's from what we share in our opinions, our demands. It's the representatives won't know what we feel if we don't talk to them. So, get to know your government. Town, city, state, federal, we have the most impact on what is closest to us. Know what issues they support and offer your opinions, because the enormity of the current problems can be overwhelming. Choose issues that are most important to you. Choose one, not 6. What's important? Climate crisis, education, anti-racism, LGBTQ rights, women's reproductive freedom, and focus on those. Write letters, emails, phone, go to the Capitol and meet with representatives. I did that a few years ago to promote better child care benefits for parents. It was an education how the senator who represented me was totally uninterested in the issue. That's when I decided to work with my local Democratic committee to put into office people who would listen to my concerns. And it worked, not by my effort, but by efforts of many people. In 2022, the school district in our area had no board members who were people of color, even though there was a large population of Black and brown students and strong evidence of some questionable disciplinary actions from a mostly white teaching staff. My husband worked with a local group of Penfield Anti-Racist Alliance, and at the next school board election, 3 people of color were elected to the board. This was in a decidedly conservative community. That same year, we elected 2 Democrats to the town council after 30 years of total Republican entrenched members. Democracy lives in each of us. Now, if you're not sure your local government or federal government works on a day-to-day basis, learn about it. I was surprised at how different governments, town, city, state, how different they work. There's no shame in not knowing. Learning will make your efforts more effective. It's important to speak to your representatives, whether they are of your party or not. Remember, the margins are slim and our votes count. Most senators and members of Congress will list the issues they are engaged with on their websites. Their committee participations and caucuses are also there listed. If they're not, call them up and ask why. Ask them what their positions are, what are they working on. Senator Gillibrand has a calendar on her site. Her site is actually the best to know really what's going on in the government because she lists schedules about when votes are coming up. It's the most valuable site that I've found. Democracy lives in the people. It is your voice that needs to direct the actions and the choices of our government. And friends, we can do this as individuals or we can do it as a church community. When I served my last congregation, excuse me, we had, okay, there goes the voice. When I served my last congregation, we had a letter writing campaign twice a year where members shared detailed information on their issues and offered ways to influence representatives. It is all possible. It is all the work of UU Faith. It is a theological calling, a theological grounding. Now, when I'm discouraged, as I have been, maybe you have too, I look for writers who have lived through many decades of the ups and downs of Americans' political disarray, writers who offer clear insight into the lessons of the past and how they offer their perspective on our current situations. Robert Reich is the former Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, and he also served Gerald Ford and President Jimmy Carter. He's one of my go-to writers. In a recent article on Substack, he offered these suggestions to help us survive the next 4 years, and I'm going to share them, paraphrasing a few for you today. First, he says, don't panic. Autocracy takes time. President-elect Trump's return to power is unnerving, but America will not turn into a dictatorship overnight or even in 4 years. Even the most determined, strong men face internal hurdles, from bureaucracy to the media and the courts. He says, legal battles, congressional pushback, market forces, midterm elections, and internal Republican dissent will slow him down and restrain him. We need to let our representatives know what's important. 2, he says, don't disengage, stay connected. After a stunning electoral loss like this, there's a natural impulse to shut off the news, log off social media, withdraw from public life. Dancing, travel, meditation, book clubs, they're all fine, he says. But eventually, opponents of democracy will return to the fight, driven by the belief in the possibility of change. The answer to political defeat is not to disconnect, but to organize. This one was hard for me to understand, but I think I wrapped my brain around it. He says, skip the protests and identity politics. Like it or not, he says, Trump's appeal transcends traditional divides of race, gender, and class. We saw that. He's formed a new Republican coalition, and to counteract this, Democrats, progressives, need to broaden our tent, even if it means trying to appeal to conservatives on some issues. Street protests and calls to defend democracy may be inspirational, he says, but they repel conservatives and suburban America. Any grassroots action must be coupled with clear, relatable economic message and showcase the leadership potential of Democratic mayors, governors. Identity politics just won't work. That's sad to me, but it's true. And we have to be pragmatic. I keep thinking, if you're old enough, you remember President Clinton, whose slogan internal in his campaign was, "It's the economy, stupid." And I think we're at that same point. We have to see and be pragmatic. And the last thing I'll share from this writer, Robert Reich, is have hope. Nothing lasts forever in the US, and we are not part of a world, we are not the only part of the world that has threats to democracy. And Americans are no different than the French, the Turks, the Hungarians when it comes to the appeal of the far right. But in a country with a strong decentralized system of government, which we have, and a long-standing tradition of free speech, the rule of law should be far more resilient than anything in the world. Trump's return to power poses challenges for democracy, but he will make mistakes, overplay his hand at home and abroad. I don't usually give a sermon like this, you know me now after a few years of being here, but I really feel that we have so much potential to make a difference. We have to stay in the fight. Sending out letters to get the vote out was absolutely the right thing to do. Now the right thing to do is to know what's going on and make sure that your voice is part of the conversation. We must be ready to fill in the gaps and create a world that uplifts all beings. That's our theological call. Protect our rights and our environment. Our theology is rooted in loving and valuing all beings. This is the call of our faith. This is the work of democracy, and democracy lives in the people. May it be so, and amen. Thank you.